profitability, who are the players. Now, this is tricky, and whether the shares of those players are changing. Because let's say you put Pepsi and Coke, and you say, oh, look, Pepsi's sale is going up. That means Pepsi must be increasing its market share of the beverage industry. But then Pepsi also has Lay's, right? Pepsi also has Yum Foods. So then what happens if you take that into account and compare it to the beverage industry? So this is easier said than done. What you have to understand is that the product has to be taken and you have to look at it from the customer's perspective. Don't take the company's sale and just say, oh, yeah, this is this company's market share. Because that company, and another example is Amazon, has a business which is web services, cloud, right? So if I want to focus on the cloud industry, well, I'm not going to take all of Amazon's sales. I'm going to only take the one which is AWS. And similarly, if Microsoft is a player in this, right? So Microsoft has their software business, but then they also have Azure, which is going to be here. And if I'm going to take Google as well, so Google has their search engine and their Android business, right? And so many others, maps, etc. And then they have their Google Cloud. So I'll take only the Google Cloud part. If I'm taking Alibaba, I'm not going to take all their other e-commerce business. I'll only take their cloud. So this is very important, that when you're talking about an industry, there might be multiple players with only one line of their product or service in that industry. So easier said than done, but good for us that there are specialist companies that are providing research that you can subscribe to, and they can help you get data about the size and growth rates and the market size and the players within each industry. Right. And how can you put them into these boxes? And biotech, right? It has best of both. So growth and defensive. So you're not, defensive means what? That you're not really exposed to the business cycle risk, and at the same time you're getting growth. So wow, lovely, isn't it? Biotech, software, gaming, nice quadrant. If you move to the left, well, it's safer because it's defensive and mature, the safest probably. So think of your local electricity company, utilities, beverages, Coca-Cola, very safe, right? Pharmaceuticals, and we're not talking about biotech here. This is your normal, mature pharmaceutical companies. And yes, mature but cyclical companies which are in crude oil, natural gas, freight transportation, etc. So not the safest because the business cycle risk is there. And then of course here you have your cyclical growth, the riskiest. So this would be the riskiest sector. You've got semiconductors, fintech, digital advertising. Surprisingly, Nvidia has been doing so well, right? So even though riskiest sector, but sometimes it just works out. Anyhow, so what's most important in the industry? Of course, profit, right? And we want a measure which is agnostic to the capital structure. Means we don't want to look at return on equity because that would, I mean, for example, if you take the example of Verizon and Etisalat, which is a telecommunication company based in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai and Dubai, Abu Dhabi. That's where Etisalat is. Or you take Saudi Telecom Company, which is also in the Middle East and the GCC, and then you take Verizon. They are very similar companies in terms of telecommunication industry, but Verizon will have a much higher return on equity. The reason for that is they have a lot more debt, right? So we shouldn't look at it like that, saying that, oh, the telecommunication industry is so profitable, look at the return on equity for Verizon. No, you have to look at the return on invested capital, which looks at overall debt and equity returns. And then if it still looks attractive, then yes, it's a good industry. So we need to have a measure which is agnostic to capital structure, and that is your return on invested capital. And if you see that an industry has this high return on invested capital for a long time, that means it has a good economic moat protecting it. Now, what does that mean? This is a term Warren Buffett uses. Now, you have a castle, and in the olden days, you would have like water protecting the castle, and what we would call this is a moat, right? Now, if instead of the castle, let's say there is a company or an industry, right? And the players in that industry are continuously having high profits. Let's call this the oil industry, and the players, let's say, are Aramco, which is the Saudi oil company, and ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi oil company, and let's say Exxon, right? Exxon, BP, Chevron, Shell. So if they all have very, very good return on invested capital, that means this industry, this oil industry, is well protected. It has a very nice economic moat protecting it. Now, to understand this economic moat, we will be looking at Porter's 5 forces, right? We will be looking at your pestle analysis to get an understanding of what are the forces at play here and how come this industry is protected. And then within the industry, you can have some that might have a differentiation focus, some that might have a cost focus. So let's take a different perspective. Let's talk about automobile industry, right? Or smartphone industry. So automobile, for example, you can have Rolls-Royce, which is a completely different type of strategy. You can have Toyota, which is a completely different type of strategy. So this would be a cost focus. This would be a differentiation, right? Which is trying to put forward a different product. Or you could put Apple here if you were talking about smartphone industry. You could put Apple in the differentiation. You could put Huawei in the cost focus. So all these things are what we're going to talk about next. Right. So how do you go about doing the market share trends? Well, simple. You just take each industry participant's revenue, and I'm talking about that business cycle, business line, product line, service line, right? Not entire Pepsi revenues and Coke revenues. You have to take it business wise, business unit wise, product line wise. And then you can calculate something called the HHI. Now, the highest HHI you can have is, the way it's calculated is you square the market share of each firm. So let's say there is only one firm and it has 100% market share. So if you square 100, that gives you 10,000. Right? So this is the highest HHI you can have. Now, the more fragmented a market is, let's say there is one which has 90 and the other one which is 10. There's only two players. One is 90 and the other is 10. So 90 squared, 90 into 90 is 8,100, right? And 10 into 10 is going to be 100. So if you add these two together, you get 8,200. So as you can see, it's not 10,000. So the more fragmented an industry gets, the lower the HHI becomes, with 10,000 being the highest if it was one firm. And what is considered to be a concentrated market? Anything above 1,500, we're getting into moderately concentrated. And then above 2,500 is highly concentrated. Now, why is this important? Remember, we talked about in the previous learning module, we talked about pricing power. And within pricing power, we said, hey, if you're a perfect competition, if you're in an industry which is having an industry structure of perfect competition, well, you can forget about pricing power, right? But then if you're into an oligopoly like the oil producing companies, or you're a monopoly, well, now you're talking some serious pricing power. right? So from an investment perspective, this is good for us. We like concentration because then we get to influence the price, and we can charge a price which is higher than the average total product cost, right? So if we're charging a price, let's say here, and this is our cost, right, and we're producing a quantity which is our MC is equal to MR, so this is going to be MC, and let's say this is my MR. So I'm producing at that point where the quantity is MC is equal to MR, but the price is much higher. Then this full box is my economic profit. I have positive economic profit. And I can only do that if I have pricing power. But then the government knows this. The government is not going to allow it. The regulation, the competition commission is going to jump into this, right? And you might be seeing the deal of Microsoft with in the gaming space, Microsoft with what is it called? The Activision Blizzard, right? I believe. So I think they got the green light in the US, but they still haven't gotten the green light in the UK. So what happens is they look at the HHI. If it's going up more than 200 points, well, they're going to be subject to regulatory challenges. So as an analyst, you need to know all of this. And then moving into Porter's five forces, this is something we've discussed earlier. I gave you the example of Reliance in the previous learning module, the Indian oil refinery, which might have a pressure on their profits not only from their existing competitors but from their suppliers like Aramco, the Saudi company which supplies them crude oil, their customers, which is fuel station networks like Indian Oil or Bharat Oil. They could put pressure on their products pricing and profitability by saying give us lower prices. Aramco could say give us higher prices. So their cost goes up, their revenue goes down. So this is what Michael Porter has basically said, right? That it's not only your existing competitors that can put pressure on your profit margin, it's also your suppliers, it's also your customers, it could be new entrants, somebody completely unrelated. Let's say Tata wants to come in to the oil refining business in India if they're already not in. So that will be a new entrant. Or substitutes like Tesla comes in and says, I'm selling electric cars in India. So then, well, that's what's happening anyways, right? They're talking about technology transfer and everything, but that's not the point. The point is then it reduces the demand for oil. So then it puts pressure on Reliance oil refineries' profit. So these are your five forces, and you need to keep your eyes on all five. So let's talk about each one of them. Substitute product, Tesla, electric vehicles coming in and saying, okay, you don't buy your normal cars with oil, fossil fuel, buy electric cars, right? So if it's easy to get substitute products, then you're going to have a lot of threat from them. And think of simple things like coffee and tea, right? So if you want to have a good economic moat, one of the things is there should be no easy substitutes available to the product that your firm is selling. Now, what examples can I give you? Let's say oil companies, right? Currently, there's no substitute for oil, fossil fuels, even though we are trying a lot because we want to save the environment. But so far, we have not been able to come up with commercially viable substitutes. So that's why, again, with the example of oil companies being in the middle, their profits are being sustainably high because they have that economic moat protecting them, right? Because there is no substitute really till date. We're trying, and recently the US scientists have had some very interesting discoveries with respect to fission and fusion, but let's see how that goes. Bargaining power of customers, again, depends on how concentrated your customers are. So if you have a lot of small customers, well, they can't really put a lot of pressure on you, right? But if you have few customers with very, very large volume, right? And again, coming back to the Reliance example, if you have one or two customers like Indian Oil with like 1000 plus fuel stations, or Bharat Oil with 1000 plus fuel stations, and they have huge volumes, and you only have like a few customers, well, then they can put a lot of pressure on you to reduce the price, right? What about suppliers? If you only have one supplier, right, they can put a lot of pressure on you. New entrants depends on barriers to entry. If you have high barriers to entry, you don't have much to worry about. But if your barriers to entry are low, well, anybody could just walk into your industry and set up shop, right? And of course, the basic, more most obvious level of competition is your direct competitors. Now, here I think it's a very interesting point, high exit barriers. What does that mean? That means they're kind of locked in with you, right? They're in, they've already made the investment, now they might as well fight with you. So, this could have a cause of becoming or intensifying the rivalry within the industry, which means prices will go low, profits will erode. So, that is an interesting aspect to this as well. All right. So, in addition to the internal factors, we also are going to look at external factors, and that's where your pestle comes in. So, political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. Let's have a look at each one of them. So, political could be due to a lot of different reasons, right? So, a lot of governments, they do things for various reasons, and you should see how that can impact the industry that you're investing in and the firm within the industry. Now, there's a lot of interlinkage between political, economic, social, because politicians, they do things for social reasons, they do things for economic reasons. So there will be a lot of interplay between these, right? But we should, of course, be analyzing all these possible external influences on the industry, including political, economic, and social, right? Technological and legal and environmental. And let me give you an example of how all of this could play out together. So let's say Reliance oil refinery. Obviously, there is a elephant in the room, which is your climate change. So because of climate change, you don't want oil products. Now there's going to be legal angle to this, right? Where they will maybe change the regulation. They could say, hey, no more hydro skimming oil refining, or you have to go with deep conversion. So the refinery will have to upgrade its equipment. That will have financial implications, and then again it will impact your valuation of it. There could be overall political or economic angles to this. There could be a technological angle to this, that as soon as the batteries that are there in electric vehicles become, there's some tech breakthrough in them and they become economically viable, and then maybe the politicians will start promoting electric vehicles. They might get into some kind of technology transfer with companies from international other countries, right? So a lot of things could happen that could play out, and you need to also see what's going on with people, right? In terms of their social dynamics, maybe they start becoming environmental conscious. So all these factors can be linked, and every case is different, every industry is different. You have to get into the analysis and say, how can my firm protect itself from the 5 industry forces? How can my firm benefit rather from the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors, and at least not be at odds with them, right? At least not be at odds with them. So I mean, if you have to choose, you would rather maybe invest in something which is going to benefit from these factors instead of, well, not benefit or maybe even be at a detriment. So you need to take into account your five forces and pestle with respect to your firm and its strategy. So what does that mean? Now we're going to bring in the three types of strategies: cost leadership, such as Toyota; differentiation, such as Rolls-Royce, right? And focus, such as, let's say, Hummer. Or I can give you various other examples. So let's say Apple in differentiation and Huawei in cost focus, right? Thuraya, which is your satellite phones. So this is your three different type of strategies. Now this is from your curriculum. I know it doesn't look very nice because it's small. So what I'm going to do I'm going to blow up each of these and show you separately. So this is the first one. And let's talk about Toyota, Rolls-Royce, and Thuraya. By the way, let me tell you, this focus, it doesn't have to be like an expensive focus. It can be it's just a niche, right? So satellite phones is a niche. Nokia tried to focus on that small phone as a niche. It thought that it would be a big thing, that people would love small phones, really small, cheap phones. And maybe they were right, but the market size was very, very small, right? Majority of the people, they want smartphones. So clearly they went the wrong way on that. But the point I'm trying to explain to you is that focus doesn't always mean that, oh, it's a very expensive product. Let me give you an example. Let's say we talk about cars. So okay, Toyota, Rolls-Royce, and we were talking about cars. Where did Thuraya come from? That's a smartphone that would go for Apple and Huawei. So in focus, let's say Hummer. And so that's an expensive car with a niche focus. And let's say Tata Nano, right? Tata Nano is a car in India which is like very, very small and very inexpensive. So it's for a completely different type of niche, right? So they are both niche, but a completely different price point. So this is your three strategies, and this, by the way, is also from Michael Porter, the Harvard professor, who has come up with the five forces. So now let's look at each one of them, right? So means of executing the strategy for Toyota, of course, it's economies of scale. That the bigger they grow, the lower their cost of production, and they benefit from that. They benefit from the economies of scope. Whereas your differentiation wants superior quality, unique features, right? Pricing is not that big of a concern here. Customers are willing to pay higher prices, but they really want something special. And then with your niche, well, it really depends. It could be either cost leadership niche or differentiation. So Tata Nano is cost leadership, right? Hummer is going to be product differentiation, but it's going to be a niche market, and you really need to understand the needs of your customers. So you need to be close to them. All right, now how does the five forces impact? So let's write our players again. Toyota, and what was it in differentiation? Rolls-Royce, and you've got your Hummer or Tata Nano, right? So now, in terms of the five forces, well, who's going to come in and mess with Toyota, because they've got such a huge advantage in terms of scale. You know, the other day I was listening to this podcast about the Panadol and paracetamol, and then one of the facts that I heard in that was like one of these Chinese companies has like 40% of the global market being served from their factory. So 40% is a lot, right? I mean, imagine the scale. So this is what happens in a cost leadership sort of a strategy, that you're so big and you've got such a huge economies of scale benefit that it doesn't really make sense for another player to come in and try and even break that, right? Unless the government is going to subsidize it, which is what we saw with TVs when Samsung came in and they had to fight Sony, which is Japanese, and Samsung is South Korean. So it's very difficult to come in and beat the cost leader, right? So that's what protects you. That's your economic moat, your size, your low cost. In terms of differentiation, it has to be customer loyalty, and the same thing goes for focus as well, because you're creating that relationship with your customer, and the customer should be loyal to you regardless of the price, right? And what else in terms of industry appropriateness? Of course, cost leadership will be appropriate for a capital intensive industry. Differentiation will be appropriate where customers really value distinctiveness. And focus will be appropriate where you have a very distinct niche of customer group, and it's not possible for other people to serve them, and you can develop that expertise and then try and keep them with you. What are the risks? What are the risks? Well, of course, if your basic premise is on cost and the cost goes up, whether you're going to be in trouble because you don't really have that pricing power. And this is what I was talking about when I said Huawei, right? Or Redmi or Xiaomi. I mean, if you're going to face high inflation in your cost and you're not going to be able to pass that on to your customers, your profits are going to erode, right? So I would rather be Apple in this case, but then Apple faces imitation by competitors, so that is a risk to differentiation, right? And then in focus, well, your buyers could just become more sophisticated and no longer demand what you're giving them. So that, my friends, is it for this learning module. We talked about how to define industries. We looked at the different classification systems. We talked about how to get an understanding of the size and growth. Especially keep that point about Pepsi and Coke in mind, because companies can have, or that point about Amazon and its e-commerce business and the cloud business. So you really need to take it product wise, right? And then within that product, say what are the five forces, competitors, suppliers, customers, right? Substitute products, new entrants. What about external influences? And then finally, what's the strategy of your firm? Right. So, what are the different systems we looked at? We looked at the one by Standard and Poor and Morgan Stanley, which is your global industry classification system. And we looked at few others. We also talked about their limitation. And we said there are some alternate ways to doing this. You can do it by geography in terms of developed markets, emerging markets, frontier markets. You could do it in terms of defensive and cyclicals, which is their sensitivity to business cycle. You could do it in terms of statistical similarities. I give you the example of hotels and airlines moving in a similar manner during the lockdown, but then of course there are different industries, so that's a problem with statistical. And then finally you could do it based on ESG factors, which could be either environmental, social, or governance factors. Then we talked about surveying an industry, coming to an understanding about its size, growth, profitability, and market share. Very, very important here to do it product line wise, right? And look at it from the customer's perspective, not just as a company's perspective. You could put them in a growth and defensive versus cyclical box. So if they are defensive and growing, they are biotech or software or gaming. So that's an interesting quadrant to be in. If you are not growing, you're mature, right? But you're defensive, then you can be pharma, right? Or utility. And if you're not defensive, you're cyclical but mature, you could be oil. And then if you're growing and cyclical, you could be something like semiconductor. So that is an interesting way of characterizing it in a style box. When it comes to analyzing profitability, we need to have a capital structure agnostic way of doing it, and that is your return on invested capital. Because if we look at return on equity, well, it will be higher for those companies which have high debt to equity ratios, right? So we'd look at return on invested capital. And of course, in terms of industry structure, we like concentrated industries because that says to us that it's more likely that the firms will have higher pricing power. But the government doesn't like that. So, of course, if there are going to be any mergers and acquisitions announced, they might be subject to a regulatory review if they are adding 200 points to the HHI. How is the HHI calculated? It is the sum of the squared market shares, and highest can be 10,000, right? Anything above 2,500 is considered highly concentrated. Then we said, okay, let's analyze the industry in terms of its Porter's five forces, which is, of course, rivalry among existing competitors and new entrants coming in within that, right? So that's your normal competition. But you can also face competition from your suppliers if they have a strong bargaining power, or your customers, again, because if they are few in number and huge volumes coming in through very few customers, they can bargain with you. Or you could have substitute products coming in and bothering you. Now, with respect to the threat from new entrants, if barriers to entry is low, there will be a lot of threat from new entrants. But if they are high, that means barriers to exit are also high. Then you'll have a lot of pressure from your existing competitors because they won't be able to leave. Either way, this is normal competition, right? But the others are something different that Michael Porter made us see, that it's not only your existing and new competitors that are your competition. You can face it from your suppliers, your customers, and your substitute products. And finally, Michael Porter also showed us that, hey, these are the broad categories of strategies that you have. You can either be focusing on bringing a low cost product to market or a different product, or you could have a niche focus, right? So you need to take these strategies and then analyze the external factors as well as the internal industry factors and see how much of a economic moat you have protecting your profits, right? And that's a term Warren Buffett likes to use. So this is, my friend, the end of the second part of this research report that we're talking about, and there's one more reading to go, and I hope to see you there.